Thank you for joining us for this evening's program on our energy future with Dr. Morgan Bazilian and Alice Jackson. I'm Claire Noble, the program manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our executive director, Dale Mosier, our board chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. We're now in our 49th year of providing the Vail community with thought-provoking and affordable programming. 2 items to be aware of before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. Feel free to type your questions in there at any time for tonight's speaker, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Also, tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and we'll post that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take just a moment to thank the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Jeannie and Dale Mosier have underwritten the winter season. Kathy and Neil Kimmel have underwritten the Hot Topics series. And tonight's program is underwritten by Pat and Larry Stewart and Pat Montgomery. The Vail Symposium is also supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our donors. If you're not a donor but would like to be, please consider visiting vailsymposium.org to donate. I hope you'll make plans to join us a week from tonight on Thursday, February 11th at 6 o'clock for a program on democracy with 2 formidable scholars on the topic, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum, whose latest book is The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, and Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institute, who spoke with us in 2019 following the release of his book, Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. That program takes place on Thursday, February 11th at 6 o'clock. Now, we turn our attention to how energy sources might evolve and what will be the impacts of this transition. And allow me to introduce our distinguished guests. I'll be providing condensed bios in the interest of time. Dr. Morgan Bazilian is the director of the Payne Institute and professor of public policy at Colorado School of Mines. Previously, he was the lead energy specialist at the World Bank. He has more than 2 decades of experience in the energy sector and is regarded as a leading expert in international affairs, policy, and investment. He holds 2 master's degrees and a PhD in areas related to energy systems and markets, and has been a Fulbright Fellow. He was a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Advisory Council on Energy and on the Global Advisory Council of the Sustainable Finance Program at Oxford University. Previously, he was deputy director at the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Alice Jackson is president of Xcel Energy Colorado, a company serving 1.4 million electric customers and 1.3 million natural gas customers. Since joining Xcel Energy in 2011, Jackson has held various positions of increasing responsibility, most recently as Vice President of Strategic Revenue Initiatives. Previously, she held the lead regulatory position with Xcel Energy Texas, New Mexico, and then with Xcel Energy Colorado. She completed the program for leadership development at Harvard University and holds a bachelor's degree in business administration with a concentration in management information systems from Texas A&M University. I'm going to hand the program over to our speakers, but I would just like to remind the audience again, if you would like to ask questions of tonight's speakers, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those questions later in the program. Morgan, I'm going to hand the program over to you.
Claire, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be speaking tonight at the Vail Symposium, and especially with my friend Alice Jackson, who's a consummate leader in the energy sector in Colorado. So it's a great honor. It's also really nice to go before people of the stature of Larry Diamond, who I know fairly well and I have a great respect for. So you have a treat coming up there. I'm going to propose to show a couple slides. That's how academics tend to work, but very few of them. Just to get us started on this rather complex topic. So we're talking about the entire global energy system and what it's going through now, which is a series and multiple ongoing energy transitions. That means there are many different changing parts of the energy system right now, and they have different motivations for those changes, from economic development to air pollution to climate change to national security. And we'll touch on a few of those and see how the conversation goes. I guess I should say, you've already heard my bio, so I don't have to go through that. If you look at the energy system over the last 170 years, roughly, this graph does, you can get a sense from this graph on what the changes have been since 1850, and with the advent of various industrial revolutions and key technologies like the steam engine, commercial aviation, television, microchips, and finally to the services, internet sector we currently exist. And then the kind of fuels that powered those systems, starting from biomass, and then moving to coal and oil and gas and hydropower and nuclear, and now much more to renewable energy. And you can see that steep curve, and that steep curve is fairly familiar to those of us that work in the energy sector. That's what we trace as our history. And now today we have a lot of pressure to change that curve, and I'll explain what I mean there. We have this graph on the left side in the red is the same kind of curve you just saw. That's the historical greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions over the last 120 years, and it goes up in that familiar way. And then on the right, what we have is these are future scenarios from something called the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change. And these are the scenarios we would need to be in to meet climate change targets. And those are usually presented in degrees above pre-industrial time. So the overall warming of the planet due to greenhouse gases. So you can see that the curves in that blue and gray are of a shape we don't know too much about in the energy sector. We're not familiar with it, and we haven't done this before. So this is a radical departure from our history. Now, one point I'll make is that those curves are technically, or I would put it to you that they're technically very feasible. In other words, we know technically what to do to get to them, but of course society is a socioeconomic technical construct, and so just the technology part alone does not suffice. One other piece about the changing energy transition is that I'll put it to you that it's largely a story of developing and emerging economies. And for much of my career, I've worked in these developing and emerging economies. If you look at this map, what you see is in the wealthy countries, or what are known as OECD, that's the acronym, countries, say the United States, the countries of Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc., you will see that energy demand, that's the amount of energy society uses, is flat or declining. So that's what those red numbers mean, and why you see a negative in front of them. So that means we're actually not demanding more energy in wealthy countries right now and over the next decades, but where we are demanding considerably more energy and energy services is in everywhere else. So that's India and China and Sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Southern America and Southeast Asia, etc. So as the OECD or the wealthy countries become less important in this global energy picture, the energy transition starts to play out in these developing countries and emerging economies. Of course, energy demand is a very wonky technical term. What that also means is, of course, infrastructure, investment, jobs, etc. So what we have now when we look across the globe are very different ways to monitor these changes. And what I mean by that is we work at the Institute I direct at the Colorado School of Mines, the Payne Institute. We work a lot with satellite data. And we can see all sorts of things that just 5 or 10 years ago would have been the purview of the national intelligence apparatus or the military only. And now we have access to them, and young people have access to them on their phones. I'll give you just a quick example of that. In the far left map, we estimated the amount of illegal oil production being produced by ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, as you like, the Islamic State terrorist group in Syria and Iraq in 2015 and 2016 without touching the ground. This was all done via satellite. And at the same time, we can see for $19.99 a month on your phone, you can see every single large oil and LNG natural gas tanker in the world in roughly real time and know where they are. So there's no more hiding certain things. So I put this out just to show you that we can see these transitions in very different ways than we used to. Now, I guess in 2019, myself and two colleagues from Europe were asked by the German government, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to tell them what the future looked like. So similar kind of conversation as we're having tonight, out to 2100. So the first thing we said was, we have no idea. And then the second thing we said was, well, let us come up with wildly wrong scenarios of what it could look like in a stylized way. So these graphs and scenarios, we did 4 scenarios, and they each have two curves. One for fossil fuels, that's in the red, and one for renewables in the green. So this is a highly aggregated, stylized, and again, totally wrong view of what the world is going to look like in 2100. But the point was not to get it right. The point was to show different scenarios of the future. And so the first of these 4 was called the Big Green Deal. Everything sort of goes swimmingly for climate change, and there's a generous climate fund and financial markets reallocate, and there's a global consensus on climate change action, et cetera. All countries work towards it. And you can see under that kind of framing, fossil fuels peter out and renewables go very high. You can tell by the tone how likely I think this is, but that's not the point of these. Again, this is just to make images of future pathways. Here's another one we called technology breakthrough, and this is where United States and China take the lead, and the big companies within those countries also emerge as dominant players, like Google, or something that you may not have heard of, which is called the State Grid Company of China. They currently employ over 1 million people, just to give you an idea. And the world fractures into rivaling camps. So all of this was done with what is called an international relations lens, not a techno-economic lens. So we did this according to political science theories and political science views of the world, not engineering or physics. And so you could see spheres of influence happening, and the curves look a little bit different, right? The renewables come up, but not quite as quickly, and they peter off a little bit. So, a little different. Here's a third one. We call this dirty nationalism. You can see a lot of grounding and reality in this. Elections bring populists to power. I imagine some of you can name a country or two where that has happened recently. You have nation first policies, right? Words like America first, you can think of. States ring fence, there's protectionism, there's nationalism. And in this one, you see the renewables rising, but then going flat, and same with the fossil fuels. So a totally different outcome. And you have this last one's called muddling on. This is very typical for expert scenario exercises. Sort of means what it says. We're going to do the same things over and over. And you can see how the curves go. The fossil fuels come down, the renewables come up, but not at the same levels. And this is the muddling on scenario. So grounded in some things that happen currently. So a couple takeaways from these scenarios, and we're presenting these as a basis for discussion. between Alice and I, and she represents a company that's at the forefront of some of this stuff, but in a smaller geographical area. So let me give you three of these takeaways. One is that even in a zero carbon world, it does not do away with zero-sum games. There's still winners and losers in this scenario. So there is still geopolitical tension. In other words, there is still tension between nations. It's just changed. The second one is that the pace of change matters. And this is a pretty important point. All of these lessons have to do with things that are happening in the United States as well. So the pace of change matters. If you have a huge system, like an energy system, changing very, very rapidly, it is very difficult to keep up with from a regulatory perspective or a policy perspective. And we can see that in the United States very clearly in what is called the fracking revolution. In other words, no one predicted the amount of natural gas that we'd or oil we'd be producing in the United States from unconventional sources. And as a result, the curve went, like we're familiar, that really fast nonlinear curve, and the regulations did not keep pace. And so policy and government was not able to keep pace with what was happening. The same thing is true on the pace of change if things are too slow. And so, like everything, I suppose, in life, depending on how you think about the Buddha, the middle road is the one we're sort of aiming for so that we can navigate this in a positive, just, equitable way. And the last one is this notion of shifting attention from goals to pathways. And what that means is that it's much easier and to transact and more viable for politicians to transact high-level targets and goals that are in the far future. So what you see now is China and Korea and South Korea, of course, the UK, all kinds of different places, and soon the United States, making targets to 2050 or 2040. This is obviously well beyond the political life of most of the people making those decisions. It's actually beyond the physical life of a lot of those politicians. And but it turns out to be much easier to transact that rather than the detailed, sort of boring day-to-day pathways to get there. And those detailed pathways are much more difficult politically. They're much more difficult analytically to think about. They're the kind of thing that Alice has to do every day. And we're saying governments should try to shift some of the attention from those high level to these pathways. I'm going to end here. The Payne Institute, you can find our work. And I wanted to say rest in peace to the three men that died in the avalanche over in San Juan County, who were members of your community, members of the Eagle County community, Seth, Andy, and Adam. I actually knew one of them, and I just wanted to put this up since we're speaking in Vail tonight, and also for the person who died today in the avalanche. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to
I can see your screen. So give me.
I can't hear you, Alice. I don't know if people can. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, Alice, right now you're a little bit frozen. Oh, okay, now you're moving again. I can see you.
Okay, sorry about that. So hopefully we stick to it, but Claire,
Yeah, I'm sorry, Alice. You just froze again. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a question, then back to Morgan. Morgan, could you give us an idea right now, what is the energy, let's say, composition in the United States? what are we still drawing on in terms of fossil fuels? What's the percentage that we're drawing on renewables? It seems to me that renewables, although they're growing fast, still represent a very small portion of our energy portfolio.
Yeah, so Claire, and it looks like Alice is back with us, so that's great because she actually knows this stuff much better than I do. One thing just for your audience, and this gets a little maybe wonky for you, but the energy system is comprised of electricity, which is what most people think about, and then other parts of the energy system, which is heat and cooling and industrial loads and this kind of stuff that most people don't probably think about. We think about the lights. And so when you see most of the goals that have come out, they would, especially for renewable energy, they really mean renewable electricity typically, even though that is often not how they're portrayed in press releases and things. So I give that to you just as background as I try to remember what the numbers actually are. But in the United States, the electricity system used to be dominated by coal, and over the last 5 to 10 years, that coal number has come down roughly at the same rate that the numbers of natural gas and renewables have come up. And so this is electricity, and Alice knows those numbers, and she's on, thankfully, much better than I do. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
So Alice, I don't know if you
hopefully
heard, the first part of the question. It was about like where we get our electricity in the United States, and I'd also be interested in knowing Colorado specific energy composition.
No, absolutely. And so each of the utilities in Colorado has a slightly different mix of electricity, but I can tell you that our numbers in 2019, our 2020 official numbers are still being finalized and verified, but as of 2019, we had roughly 30% of the energy that we deliver to our customers coming from renewable resources, roughly another 33 to 35% coming from natural gas, 25 to 30% coming from coal, and then the remainder coming from other resources, whether it's some hydro or other facilities that we have under contract or market purchases. So that's been generally the mix. And, I think through time that has, the renewable numbers are coming up pretty significantly. 2004 was when we started in Colorado with a ballot measure that put in place our renewable portfolio standard. At that point in time, it was 10%. By 2020, all utilities in the state had to have their renewable percentages up to 30%. So I expect our numbers to come out for 2020 as higher than that, because we did add substantial amounts of wind to the system in 2020 that started producing in the August and September timeframe. So that should even help the number get even better than what we saw in 2019. So really excited to see the transition. We have a lot more coming too, but I'll go over that in my presentation whenever you're ready.
Yeah, well, why don't you go ahead and go into that then?
Okay, perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. My apologies for the connection issues. Hopefully with my phone connected, even if I freeze on the screen, it's a pleasant look, but you can still hear me as I continue talking. So I do have the pleasure of serving as the president of Xcel Energy here in Colorado. And as Claire shared with you all, we do have both an electric side of our business and a natural gas side of the business. I'm going to focus exclusively on the electric side of the business in Colorado today. For those of you that are less familiar with Xcel, Colorado is not our only state that we provide electric and natural gas services in. We also provide those in 7 other states across the country. And if you think of it as kind of a line right down the middle of the U.S. So from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan through Wisconsin, over to Minnesota, North and South Dakota, through Colorado, and then down to the Panhandle of Texas and eastern and southeastern New Mexico. So quite a different range of service territories, from rural to very urban. The politics across those states are very interesting as well. So that doesn't mean we always have the same preferences and interests from our customers and from our communities or our governments even as you look at those states. But because I'm responsible for Colorado primarily, I'm going to focus my time and effort here with you all tonight on that. And Morgan and I get to have more global conversations, but I'd really like to let you know kind of where the progress has been made here in Colorado. Because despite all of those different scenarios that Morgan was talking about, and they're very valid ones, and they go out through 2100, which I'm not going to be going out quite that far tonight. But despite all those scenarios, I really do think Colorado has been a leader. Regardless of the administration at the federal level, we have continued to press the envelope in Colorado on what we can do. And as I was mentioning in answering the question that Claire was asking is, 2004 was really when our history started on a very interesting trajectory. But it also poses a really interesting challenge for us as utility providers. Because one of the primary and foundational pieces of what it is that we do is provide a highly reliable service, and we have to focus very closely on the economics and the affordability of the service that we are providing. And so when we focus on those two things, it means that we have to ask a lot of questions about physics. Because at the end of the day, it comes back to, is that electron going to be able to be generated when the customer needs it, transfer through the wires so that everybody out there can live their lives whenever they need to, and make their widgets, run their businesses, stay warm and comfortable in their homes, you name it. And so that's a pretty big challenge when you're talking about changing the utility system. In 2004, when that ballot measure came forward, we weren't necessarily gung-ho about going, okay, let's get as many renewables on the system as we can, because it injected variability and risk into our system. When you're talking about having to maintain high levels of reliability, knowing that when you call on a resource to turn on and do something brings you a lot of comfort. So we've partnered with people, and namely the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NCAR, in order to figure out how do we close the gap on the technological side. And we've really been able to embrace the technology and figure out how to integrate it on our system so that today we're at very high levels of wind resources on our system. I'm going to give you a few numbers just to kind of put this in proportion. Here in Colorado on the Xcel Energy system, our system peaks at what's called 7,100 megawatts. That's the peak demand we currently experience on our system in Colorado. That's when, imagine the really hot day outside when all the air conditioners are running. That's the maximum amount of consumption that a customer is demanding of the utility in order to provide at that point in time. And that has shifted over time, but it stayed pretty flat for the past several years. And we expect it to be staying pretty flat going forward for the next few. But then we get into conversations like beneficial electrification or transportation electrification, which are going to start impacting that. But meeting that demand is something that is a huge responsibility. And right now on the system in Colorado, to meet some of that demand, we do have a lot of wind. We have roughly 4,000 megawatts of wind installed on the system. Now, people would sit there and say, now, wait a minute, you just told me that you were about 30% kilowatt hours of energy produced and delivered to customers in 2019, but 4,000 divided by 7,100, that's a much bigger number. Well, wind and solar are obviously variable energy resources. I have not figured out how to get that, red phone or the bat phone to be able to pick up and say, hey, God, can you make the wind blow a little bit stronger, maybe a little bit less, or can you hold it, move the clouds aside? That's just not something we can do. And so we have to take into account, and quite frankly, the wind and the solar don't produce all the time. Obviously, solar only works when the sun is up, unless it has a battery storage unit connected to it. So that means that we have pieces of the puzzle we still have to fill in with other resources. Namely, one of the big complexities that we've been having to face, and love this conversation with Morgan of talking about the science behind figuring out the equations, is I mentioned that 7,100 megawatts on the system. When we do resource planning, which we are required to do every 4 years before the Public Utilities Commission, who's our regulator here in the state of Colorado, we go before them and we sit there and say, here's how much we expect our customers to need, so that peak load, and then here's how much we have on the system, so what are the gaps? But when you're planning that, for the past several decades, we've been essentially going in and saying our peak load is 1 hour a year, and we really need to plan for that highest peak, that 1 hour in a year. And then any other time during the year, you would just call on those resources because you needed less during those other hours, and you were covered and you were good to go. Well, starting with our 2017 electric resource plan that came to a decision in 2018, our world started changing, because by adding as many renewables as we have on the system right now, we are not only the 30%, but as we move towards the 55% renewables delivered to customers that we expect to be at by 2025, that is going to be a very different environment for providing those services to our customers. So let's kind of lay it out. Wind has variable energy, primarily blows at night, heavier during the springtime, less during the summertime. Solar only produces during the day unless it's backed up by a battery resource. And it's primarily during the summertime, you're going to see a much higher intensity, so bigger output from that solar during the summer than you do during the winter. So not only is it inside of a day that you have variability, but over seasons you have variability as well. So what we've had to start doing is, in order to optimize this technology into how we deliver this energy to customers, we can no longer plan for just 1 hour inside of a year and be good to cover everything else. We have to actually start planning for 8,760 hours a year. And not only do we do that, when we do planning, you have that forward look, that's perfect foresight, right? But in real time, the weather is always going to throw a little bit of a lump at you. And you have to figure out, how do you manage then around a system that has bomb cyclones, like what we experienced in 2019, or we have multi-day duration of blizzards. So looking at that piece of the puzzle, we have incredibly increased the complexity of figuring out, how do we plan the system? I'm excited to say that we'll be bringing our next electric resource plan before our regulator, the Public Utilities Commission here in Colorado, on March 31st of this year. And that plan has to include in it the energy transition that we committed to in our announcement that we made in December of 2018, and then was codified into law in 2019, which is to reach at least an 80% carbon reduction from our 2005 levels by 2030, and continue progress toward reaching a zero carbon system by 2050. As the first utility in the United States to make these bold announcements and these goals, we know we're leading the way, and that there are still complexities we have to figure out. Between now and 2030, we think we can make it there with the resources that we have, and we think we can make it there both reliably and cost effectively. Beyond 2030, there's a lot of technology advancement that we have to be looking at. And I can't tell you exactly which one's going to come in and fill the gap, but I can tell you that there's a lot of interesting technologies out there developing today. And whether that's including hydrogen from electrolysis processes, an ammonia or hydrogen blend that you can burn in combustion turbines, or other solutions that we haven't even explored quite yet, we are really looking forward, and we are trying to make sure that we are putting the appropriate problem statements out there, so that organizations such as Morgan's can do the research into what are the things that we need to do and what are the technologies that need to develop to close the gaps. So if you can't tell, I'm really excited about the time frame that we are in our industry right now. There are many different pieces of the puzzle for us to look at. And the last one that I'll mention and go into a little bit more before we go into some Q&As and conversation back and forth between Morgan and I, is the focus that we have to have on not only affordability for our customers, but the just transition that we have to make for our communities that are impacted by this transition. And I really do think that goes to Morgan's comment about, how do we not go too fast or too slow, but figure out how to take Buddha's middle role, or if you like a different analogy, Goldilocks, the just right. Don't be too hot, don't be too cold. Figure out the just right path, so that we can help these communities transition in this time. And I think it's really important to focus on those communities, to listen really well to what it is that's important to them. What do they want their future to look like? What do they want to prioritize? And figure out, as we do this transition, how do we all engage and figure out what does that look like as we move through time? And so not all the answers are going to be perfect, but I do think that the trajectory and the path that we're on is really exciting. As I said, you know, the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. Here in Colorado, we've been able to show that there is a pathway. We already have approval, and we're implementing resources on the system so that by 2025, we'll see a 60% carbon reduction from our 2005 levels. We'll have that 55% renewables delivered to our customers. And quite frankly, from the affordability side, our rates and total bills in the state of Colorado for our residential customers are more than 35% below the national average. Those are really good numbers to have. And they're a great example for us to move forward with, and showing others, how do you bring this together as well? How do you build community? What can you do? And really show a progress and a future that can be successful for all of us. So with that, I'll stop talking because I'm sure you all are going to be more interested in the conversation that happens between Morgan and I, as well as getting to your questions. So Claire and Morgan, ready to turn it back over to you.
I do have a lot of questions, but Morgan, if you want to jump in and ask any questions back to Alice, I can hold off for just a moment.
No, I think your questions that you have are up there are terrific, and I'm used to seeing all of them at events. So you can go through those as you like. I just wanted to highlight sort of one of the last things that Alice said, which I think is really important aspect of this, and is getting a lot of airtime in the Biden administration, which is this issue of just transitions. So what we call just transitions, and that is making sure that communities are whole as they go through these various energy transitions. It's mostly manifest nationally and internationally so far in the closing down of coal plants and what those communities do either at mines who mine coal or at the coal plants themselves. And the Biden administration is very taken with this. There's already some action coming out of those executive actions towards that. The state of Colorado is actually, as is often the case in energy, taking a leading position on this and has established something called the Office of Just Transitions. And Xcel, and Alice herself has done some tremendous work in the towns just north. I'm sitting in the Fraser Valley right now, so just north of where I'm sitting. And I think it's worth highlighting that. I don't know if Alice feels like talking to that, but I think it's a really important aspect of this. And it plays to that issue I said in my presentation, that these are not solely technical systems, but they are socio-technical systems. In other words, linkages between society and technology. So I don't know if Alice was willing to say something.
No, Morgan, I think you're exactly right. Very technical when it comes down to you've got to get the physics of the system right, so that you're delivering the energy at time when people need it, so that you don't have flicker or voltage issues or any outages, right? So you really have to manage and have a lot of technology in making sure that we maintain the physics of the system, because no matter what we do, you can't legislate the physics. But as far as society goes, it has very practical impacts on society when we're talking about the cost of electricity when you look at economic development, because there isn't a single entity that doesn't require some form of electricity. And whether that's investing as a standalone, since you're not on the grid, or you're on the big grid, it's going to cost you something. And those entities that have higher intensity for the electric consumption, they're going to be looking for where can they get low cost, affordable, clean energy as compared to other locations. So if we want our communities in the state of Colorado to be cost competitive against others, we've got to manage that cost of electricity. But not only that, at the end of the day, how much do we really want a person's income and their household income to go towards paying their electric bills? And so that's something that we have to keep in mind as we continue to move forward, is how do we make this transition? We make it affordable for our customers, as well as we look at what are the impacts on the businesses and the jobs in the communities. So going back to the community piece just real quick, and then I'll stop on this one, but I feel like it's an important piece. It's not a matter of just replacing tax base in a community. A community is based off of the fabric of the connections of the people that are there. So when you talk about changing, whether it's the average income at a plant that's closing in the community or something along those lines, it causes people to move, which starts breaking down some of that fabric of that community as well. So figuring out not only how do you replace maybe the tax base or the bonding capacity or the things that are needed for the schools and the fire departments and police departments, but at the end of the day, also, what do you need in order to maintain the underpinning culture of that community? That's important. So looking at the replacement of jobs that are equivalent for the income level is the other layer of complexity in solving this puzzle.
Can I just add, Claire, just to that for this audience in particular, and I don't know if he's on this call or someone from his team, but Governor Ritter's team at the Colorado State University just released a really cool set of videos or films documenting some of the issues that the towns in the north part of Colorado are going through. I don't know if you've seen that or not, Alice, but they're really worth a watch. I'd recommend them to your audience. The center of the new energy economy, I think is the name.
Yeah.
Yeah, that Governor Bill Ritter runs, and so they did a great job on that. They're really sort of beautifully done little vignettes of people's stories in those towns, and they speak to exactly what Alice just said. So I just wanted to add that. And then Claire, you can manage those questions as you like. They come in the normal categories for by normal, I mean what people who are in the energy sector and have been going to energy conferences for 20 years have. So they fall into the categories of nuclear, battery storage, costs, and then a couple other sort of fun ones about birds and things like that. So we can go through them as you like.
Well, I'm going to ask one that I think is a quick one, and then we'll go into another that needs a little bit more depth. But a question came up of when will renewable energy costs dip below that of fossil fuels? And I thought that had already taken place. Is that not the case?
Yeah.
So I can speak to this
Alice,
one a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Okay, so just to give you some very pointed examples, back in 2006, 2007 timeframe when we started acquiring the wind resources on our system, those wind resources, and they're still under contract today, were around 6.9 cents per kilowatt hour. The last electric resource plan that we had in 2017 and 18, we acquired those resources through an RFP process in 2019. They were 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So pretty dramatic decrease in cost for those resources on the system. Solar, we've seen some of the same similar decreases. Our early solar contracts that we have on the system are 16 cents per kilowatt hour. And on the low end, what we're seeing now is about 2.5. And with battery storage, you're seeing it around 3 to 3.5, depending upon where it's located and what they can do with the battery storage. So we have seen those cost curves come down. And that's a real benefit for the system. What I would say is, just like I was discussing before, though, is that when you compare that back against the other, fossil-based generation or carbon-based generation on the system, it doesn't fit all the hours. And so you still have to figure out, how do you close the gap between the hours that are not served? And that's the real conundrum that we're all working through right now as we do this transition and figure out, how do you either use battery storage? How do you build your fossil-based generation so that it can be very flexible and move around when the wind and solar is available? And those are the real problems that we're all working to solve right now.
Well, I mean, since batteries came up, it is one of the questions that we're getting a lot is, what about battery storage? Haven't there been some technological advancements in that area that help it to smooth out these variable energy sources?
Morgan, do you want me to start?
Go ahead, Alice. No, you're on a roll. That's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So battery storage absolutely has seen some technological improvements. One of the first things I always like to point out is we've had batteries in some form of storage or not for quite some time. A perfect example is in Georgetown, Colorado. We have what's known as our Cabin Creek pumped hydro facility. It's a really big battery, but it's run with gravity and water and large pumps and a generator that makes electricity whenever you open those flow gates, and the water flows down the hill, and then you pump it back up, usually at night when the loads are low and the cost is low, in order to get it back up into the reservoir at the top. That has been around since the 1950s. And so it's not unusual for us to have batteries on the system. The latest discussion really is focused on lithium-ion batteries. And those lithium-ion batteries, they come with pros and cons. You can absolutely use a lithium-ion battery to offset a short-term peak period. The reason I say short-term is it's 4 hours in duration is what you generally get from lithium-ion batteries. And so they have certain specific uses you can put on the system. But if you can imagine a blizzard in the state of Colorado for multiple days, if the wind, is either blowing too fast or it's not blowing at all, or the sun, is covered by the clouds, those batteries would have to last us, say, on average 3 days. And 4 hour duration means you're going to have to daisy chain a whole lot of batteries together to close the gaps. So that's why, you look at it, there's pros and cons. There are things that absolutely can help with. Ancillary services, which are really quick movements on the grid that we have to manage to. They're great technologies to help with that. But it's a matter of, how do we solve some of those seasonal issues and focus on those pieces of the puzzle too.
So the other question, and Morgan, you've anticipated this, is nuclear. Why aren't we talking about nuclear power?
Yeah, just before I do that, because the nuclear question is ubiquitous in these conversations, is just to expand what Alice said. I agree with all of it. It was all factual. It's just that the answer to your question, when will renewables become cheaper than fossil fuels, is it matters where, and it matters in what sector or what niche they're operating in. So but in general, in many applications, in many jurisdictions, and by jurisdictions I mean countries and regions of the world, renewables have hit that mark. And the work that Alice and Xcel did on their bidding process that she mentioned was absolutely cutting edge and showed just exactly how those prices were, because what they put out was what they called a technology agnostic, I think that's the word you used, technology agnostic bid. And so that could be anything. And so this leads me to the nuclear question. A nuclear power plant could have bid into that as well, or theoretically, in a technology agnostic. That means they don't care what technology, they're trying to find the lowest cost for their customers that meets their system requirements and their goals, et cetera. And I don't believe any nuclear power plants came into that bidding process from what I saw. And the reason is relatively simple, and that's because it would not be able to compete in the time frames and at the scales and at the costs that the other competitors came in. So, okay, I leave that as Exhibit A. Of course, nuclear power is important in other jurisdictions, in other places in the United States even, and in some European countries, of course, in Japan and France and other places. And there are permits being, or okay, let's call it permits. There are plants that are planned for construction, but the current generation of the nuclear fleet factually suffers from long delays in construction and high costs. That is just a fact of the current fleet. And there is a lot of hope, especially in the nuclear community, such as it is, that the new generation, which are mostly small, they're called small or modular nuclear reactors, SMRs or MMRs, will come and fill an important niche. And that goes back to what I said before, that you have to look at the cost question in specific places and in specific applications. And the same is true for nuclear. And so, theoretically, there will be new nuclear built in this small and modular reactors with really interesting new companies and really interesting people that are running these companies in different jurisdictions. It's just right now not as competitive as the others. So that's the answer to the question.
So I would just like to pivot a little bit to transportation. Karen Nold has a question regarding the use of energy for transportation and what percentage of energy goes to transportation around the world. And I would just add on to that, my understanding that Xcel has come up with a transportation electrification plan. And I'm just wondering, Alice, if you'd be able to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll leave Morgan the worldwide, energy usage in for transportation to you. But as far as here in Colorado, yes, we fully expect that the transportation sector is going to continue a transition more and more into the electrification sector. And so we did approach, so legislation was passed in 2019 that said it's time for us to really plan and take a look at this as far as how can utilities help and focus on providing access to electrification of transportation in a broad array. So in May of last year, we presented to our regulator a plan that would invest roughly $100 million over the next 3 years in order to help with that energy transition. We expect that by 2030, we'll have roughly 600,000 electric vehicles in the Xcel Energy territory in the state of Colorado. And that goes a long way towards the governor's executive order and interest in reaching 940,000 electric vehicles in the state of Colorado by 2030 as well. And so looking at that, we figured out, okay, how do we break that down into helping people start that transition now, provide advisory services, make sure we're focusing on multifamily housing, different various avenues that people are going to need to access this electrification for charging of their personal vehicles. And that's really a focus on, light duty versus heavy duty. Heavy duty is coming, but we all have to, consider and look at that a little bit differently as well. But yes, there's plenty of investment there. We expect, our goal as a corporation is to reach 1.5 million electric vehicles across all 8 states. We think we can help our customers do that, help our communities do that, and actually save money when you look at their cost of fuel savings between electricity and gas. And so there's some great benefits, we believe, for customers in moving this direction, as well as air quality and health benefits.
Morgan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Oh, that covers it pretty well. I mean, if people haven't seen the new ad with Will Ferrell from GM, I think it's GM, that's just made gone viral on various social media sites, then you should have an idea of the zeitgeist of the electric vehicle market. In other words, when a video like that is made, no matter what you think about it or the company or how they were only a few months ago suing for something like this to happen, the change is rapid. And so we might see another one of those curves that we've seen for solar and for that I said was familiar in the energy space. And I think that point Alice made at the very end is really important, that the energy system is not changing everywhere just because of climate change. The local air pollution is a much more motivating factor for politicians and people than climate change is in general, and certainly in developing countries. And so the benefit of the electric vehicle to limit those kind of emissions is significant and plays to that strength, where air pollution really becomes a much more motivating factor. So yeah, just some thoughts on that. I just saw one question. I just wanted to clarify for people in your audience. Someone said, what happened over the last 4 years? Has NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, been gutted? I think was the word used. And the answer is it wasn't gutted at all. It actually had its highest levels of funding ever under the Trump administration. So just something to keep in mind. No one thought that would be the case, but it was the case.
Well, I had warned you earlier that I was going to ask about hydrogen, and we have an audience member who coincidentally is named Alice, and she's asking about the pros and cons of hydrogen energy. And I also want to throw out there, not just, my envy of Japanese hydrogen vehicles, but also in Germany, Siemens is rolling out a hydrogen train. So how realistic is hydrogen as an energy source for us?
You want me to try that, Alice? You're on mute. Okay. Look, there is considerable interest in what is called the hydrogen economy coming in to sort of help in this energy transition because of some of the properties of hydrogen. So answering that question takes a lot of context from someone like me. So that might be kind of annoying, but let me just say that the answer to the hydrogen story is likely, again, to be in certain niche applications. So it might find its way into certain industrial processes. It is unlikely in the short term to compete with electric vehicles, passenger electric vehicles, but may compete at heavy duty vehicles or other kinds of transport. And how it's produced is actually kind of colorful, literally. And so the way we think about hydrogen is either gray, blue, green, and recently someone came up with olive in between green and whatever, I get lost with it. But how you produce hydrogen, whether it's from renewable energy and what's called electrolysis, or from natural gas, which is called methane formation, matters to the impacts the hydrogen has. But in general, it's a very interesting vector in the energy sector, and no doubt will find its way much more than it is now, and into things like ammonia and things. But it gets very technical very quickly. And I believe it's going to shine only in certain niche markets in certain places. That's my view.
Yeah, so from my perspective, one of the beauties of the hydrogen or the hydrogen ammonia component, it is once again a storable asset. So it's a fuel type that you can put in a tank and then you can call on it in order to generate electricity with zero emissions, depending upon, once again, as Morgan was saying, on how it was generated in the first place. And so it comes with, the zero carbon component, but that storage piece of it is very appealing. But going back to the beginning of what Morgan said, it's an economic question. At this point in time, I would equate the point of, hydrogen pricing to that dollar amount I gave you on solar at the beginning of the curve. So some of this is about investment. I'm very encouraged by the investment that's being made by the European Union in researching this technology to see if we can get that electrolysis process price to come down. I think there's real potential if we can get that price to come down, that it has a place in our environment and in meeting the needs of the system as we move forward through time. The other beauty of it is when we look at our systems that we have out there, whether they're combustion turbines or it's the pipes that we have in the ground, blending hydrogen or using hydrogen in those facilities is something that you can do at very low cost. You have certain thresholds you have to worry about when it comes to the pipeline system. But when you're talking about burning it or a hydrogen ammonia blend into a combustion turbine, there aren't many modifications you have to make to those in order to be able to use that fuel type. So it's a very promising area. But the other thing I will say is that we've been talking about the hydrogen economy, and I think every year everybody has said it's 10 years out, right, for probably 2 or 3 decades, Morgan. So really it's the question of, is now the time? Is there enough impetus, interest, and advancement that can be made, particularly around the electrolysis side, to make it a viable product for us to use? It's either that, or what we'll get to is that we're at the very tail end of the transition to a zero carbon future, and it can solve that last 2%. And because that is so expensive to hit with other technologies, maybe this is the one that closes that gap. A lot of time, to work on these things and move forward, but those are the kinds of the considerations that are going through our head. It's an economic question, but there's absolutely a place where it provides value. It's a matter of, can you get that cost benefit analysis to balance out?
We've been getting a couple of questions around the concept of just transition. So Morgan, I just wanted to go back to you for clarification. When we're talking just transition, we're talking really from a US perspective of, right, helping places where there's coal mining or coal-fired plant that's being shut down. We're not talking about helping other countries that might, Middle Eastern countries that, might have a diminished need for oil in the world, or Russia for that. And we're not talking about other countries, are we?
Yeah, so this is a semantics issue. It's a really good question. So the history of just transitions mostly actually comes from European labor organizations. And so it certainly relates to what has happened over time in labor unions in Europe. So those aren't so different from the United States as markets in many cases. Of course, like most things in the United States, it's a rather parochial discussion where we think that everything in the United States is the only thing going on. So, but yes, that issue of just transitions I mentioned. So the focus right now is on, say, OECD countries or wealthy countries and the closing of coal plants, but that soon may come to touch on what happens in oil and gas markets. So as a lot of your listeners will know, oil and gas markets had an extremely difficult year or two, and there's been a lot of layoffs and there's been a lot of job losses, even right here in Colorado. And so how we help communities in these transitions relates not just to coal, first of all. The wider aspects of making countries whole or dealing with development, say, in least developed countries, could also be under the heading of just or justice, sort of inherently, but that is a different application of the terminology, as you suggest.
So we are really just about out of time. And so I told you all I would give you the last word. I'm hoping you will frame it in a look perhaps into the near future, let's say 2030. What are you excited about over the next 10 years? What are you optimistic about? And we'll start with Alice, and then we'll give Morgan the last word.
Sure, absolutely. So in my conversation, I mentioned, we go before our regulator here in a month. And in that particular plan, we will be laying out what the plan is to transition our energy system here in Colorado through 2030. So it's a really exciting time. You're going to get a preview into that forecast, whenever we go before them at the end of March. And I'm really excited because what it's going to show is we can meet that 80% carbon reduction affordably and add incremental renewables to the system. And that really, in my mind, not only makes Colorado a leader, but it continues Colorado's leadership in figuring out how do we do this in a way that makes sense for the customers. Now, at the same time, I will also say that we are incredibly blessed in the state of Colorado with the wind that we have, with the solar resources that we have, and not every single state has that same benefit or those same opportunities that we do here. So it's an exciting time to be looking at this. I have a lot of optimism about us making incredible leaps forward in meeting not only our state's goals, but setting examples for others around the country on how you can work and put forward a plan and integrate this into a system that makes sense, but also meets the IPCC guidelines, all of the climate change pieces of the puzzle, and does it in a way that maintains the reliability of the system so that we can be economically, opportunistic, I guess you could say, and people still look at the systems here and they want to build their businesses here so that we can continue to be a vital and growing organization.
Yes, I guess I'm optimistic on some of the same things. So it's terrific being located in Colorado, where there is so much great leadership from Xcel and Alice, and also from at the government level. I think that the governor's office of energy is doing a terrific job, and that the policy coming out of Colorado in issues like climate change and air pollution and energy transitions is really world-class and leading. And so lovely to be in a place where that is happening. And that's not just in the electricity side, but on things like methane emissions and monitoring, and also on just transitions, and where Colorado really is sort of leading the way on a lot of things. And most recently, the governor launched the Colorado climate change pathways, and both Alice and I were involved in different ways in that. And I think that was a really sophisticated, thoughtful process and outcome. So a lot to be thankful for here in Colorado, or optimistic about. And thank you very much for having me too.
Morgan, Alice, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. I think I probably speak for a lot of people that it's really reassuring to have such brilliant, competent people tackling some of our most pressing societal problems. So thank you very much for your time tonight. For everyone at home, thank you for joining us. And I hope you'll tune in next week on February 11th when we have a discussion on democracy with Ann Applebaum and Larry Diamond. Good night, everyone.